right, welcome back. This is going to be Microeconomics, Chapter 7, Production, Costs, and Industry Structures. So if you want to take a second, pull out the notes that I've provided, and hopefully you've done the reading too. I'll walk you through the notes and we'll talk a little bit about this stuff. All right. So here we go. Here we're going to get into the theory of the firm. And the next 4 or 5 chapters, I believe, are all about the theory of the firm. So we'll introduce the basic concepts here, and then we'll start picking at the nitty-gritty in the next few chapters, all right? So a firm is a producer or business which combines inputs of labor, capital, land, or raw or finished component materials to produce output, right? So this is a firm is a corporation or some entity that produces a product using input. Okay, production, by definition of the book, goes beyond manufacturing and includes any process or service that creates value, including transportation, distribution, wholesale, retail sales. So this is also going to include advertising. It's going to include even things like word of mouth is something that is not mentioned a whole lot and not spoken about, but it is there's a whole little strand of the economics literature about word of mouth advertising and trust in corporations and in trust in products, things of this sort. So I think it's becoming more important over time as now we're seeing all of these different social platforms for grading your retail experience or your restaurant experience or the product that you've just purchased. And companies are learning this and are even starting to pay people to make fake reviews. And so it's going to be a very interesting process to see how it plays out and whether the legislatures want to take any part in saying, okay, companies, you got to stop making fake reviews. It's disingenuous at best. And, it's just manipulating your customers at worst. So I've been watching the market quietly for the last couple of years, and people are starting to notice, and it's starting to frustrate some people, and there are even some politicians talking about it a little bit. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, that's a whole offshoot on that. So we've got the firm and production, right? And we're going to talk about the theory of the firm. So we're going to move to section 1, explicit and implicit costs, accounting, and economic profit, right? So the very most basic concept we need to know if we're running a company or if you want to get into the individual micro level economics is profit, right? And profit simply is revenue minus cost. And revenue, of course, is going to get a lot more intricate over time. We'll build into what that means. Cost is also going to get more intricate, and we'll build into what that means. But at its very core, profit is revenue minus cost. Revenue, if you want to break it down a little further, is price times quantity. How many of this unit are we producing? Or whatever it is. Name a product, and at what price. And that price clearly is going to vary over time. And so we need to find an equilibrium point at which price and quantity and our total revenue are at their maximum, and we're minimizing the cost to maximize profit, right? We also have 2 different kinds of costs. If we're talking about costs, we have explicit and implicit costs. Some things are very easy to sort of calculate. You can even have a receipt for it, right? If we're in, I don't know, what is our company? Say a pest control company, because this is what my dad did his whole life. You got a pest control company. Some of your costs are going to be things like the chemicals that it takes to kill the pests, right, or to create a barrier to keep the pests out, because really just killing them isn't all that helpful. Another is going to be your labor. Another is going to be advertising. But then there are more implicit costs, right? Like your trucks are getting worn down over time, and it's going to take maintenance to keep them running as an operational fleet so that your crew can go out to all of their stops, right? And so that That's the sort of thing that really gets a lot of entrepreneurs is they forget to calculate these implicit costs, these sort of quiet and unspoken costs that really start to add up in the long run. What is 4 sets of tires, 6 oil changes, 2 new air filters, and maybe a transmission every third year going to cost you? I mean, that's a lot of money that you're not really thinking about calculating in the short term, or even that anyone really explains to you, like, this is going to be a cost for your business, or even like maintenance on your building, or, man, crap, we need a plumber this month, something, Big Joe took a really big poop, and now we need a plumber. It's going to cost us like $270 this month. Man, we didn't calculate for this sort of thing. And so these are the things you have to watch out for, right? Explicit costs are really clear. They're upfront, right? My chemicals, my labor, all of this sort of stuff. The implicit costs are a lot more difficult. Even the cost of someone going out there and trashing you online, right? This company did a really bad job, or the guy was a real jerk when he came to my house and he got really snippy with me, and I mean, that will really cost your company if you're not very careful. So you got to be very careful about understanding the true costs of producing these goods, especially if you're an entrepreneur or a small business owner, where your profit margins are very small, at least to begin, when your company's first getting off the ground, and a really small implicit cost can just kick your butt, and that's how a lot of companies fail. So always have that in the back of your head, like implicit costs. What am I not thinking about that's going to cost me? That I need to calculate into my long run calculations for running this business or whatever it is. Okay. Types of profit. We have accounting profits. So this is just revenues minus costs. But then we have the economic profit, which is the one that people don't think about, and this is the one that's tied to those implicit costs, right? So the accounting profit, the profits that you keep on the books, pretty easy, right? Because you have receipts, you got ins and outs, and you have to pay your taxes, and you have to keep these numbers, right? Your costs and these sort of things, so you can write them off, or your taxes, or you can pay your people, or all of these things. But how do you calculate the cost of a bad review, or somebody who's really out there just trying to tank your company? That's really difficult, and so that's the economic profit that they're talking about here. Is where you're really trying to calculate the implicit costs too, right? And even in the pest control example, like the wear and tear on your vehicles or on your building, those are things you really need to think about if you're a business owner and you're investing in a building, or if you're a farmer, you have to think about, like, what is my soil quantity, not quantity but quality, because that is sort of an implicit cost. Like, I'm not going to get a perfect yield because my soil is only at like 85% this year of its nutrients, and I really need to work towards getting it up there. That's another cost, right? And so you got to be very careful about these really small marginal things that can get you in trouble if you're not calculating correctly and you're just thinking about the simple receipts. Okay, section 2. Production in the short run. Of course, in this example, in this subsection, basically, we're going to be assuming that our long-term costs are fixed, and that the only thing that we can manipulate or vary or work around the margins with is going to be your short-term costs of your business. Okay, get a little tea. Okay, so you're playing only in the short term here. So what is a short term versus a long term? I guess we should discuss that first. Your long term are going to be your assets, right? Maybe your technological capabilities, like say we're a metal producer. What is our drill press capability of the number of presses per hour? Like that is a limit. And it is something that you can't really change in the short term, right? What is our factory size? Are we running with 10,000 square feet or are we running with 100,000 square feet? That is not something that you can change in the here and now in the next week, right? And you have long-term leases, especially on big factories. Sometimes they'll have 5, 10, 20, even 50-year leases on their land or on the factory. So this is something you have to consider too, like calculating in the long-term costs, right? Am I a company that's wanting to lease a piece of land and build a production facility on it for 20 years? That means that I can only play in the short-term cost function if I do that. So I need to calculate what it's going to cost me 20 years down the road, and is it good for me to just have a short-run rent versus a long-term buy? So in the short run, the only things that we can really affect are our inputs. Okay, say we can produce anywhere between, say, 5,000 and 20,000 baseball bats. I don't know. Deciding what level of output, that's something we can affect in the short run. How many employees do we have? We can affect that in the short run, anywhere between 10 and 500 or something. What else can we affect in the short run? So yeah, this is really only going to be your sort of technology and your capital, your not capital, your labor, natural resources. And the capital side of it, your assets, are going to be long-term sort of things, right? Because natural resources, even, they're really hard to ramp up production. And so we see stopgaps a lot of times in the production. The Economist last week was talking about balsa wood. It's very interesting. The center pieces of the giant windmills they use in Texas and in other places for green energy, wind energy, the center of it is made of balsa wood. And so there was this huge run on balsa wood. All of these companies in China flooded into this country. It was like Guatemala or Honduras or something. I'm sorry, it was like a month ago. But they flooded into this country. They ate up as much balsa wood as they could, but there was problems, right? Because they weren't letting it dry out as long. There were people stealing balsa wood and shipping it off, and it was rotting en route. And so you get to all of these really these sort of run on the market problems, and so it's really difficult to actually affect your land and raw material resources in the short run without building infrastructure projects to do that, right? Because it's really hard to strip stuff out of the ground or rip up trees and send them halfway across the world. And there are severe difficulties, and there are problems with the logistics, as I was talking about the rotting wood, that make this sort of stopgap, right? And so it's really not a short-term factor. Maybe if there's some on the market, you can buy a little bit more. But the only sort of short-term factors we're talking about right now are going to be like labor. That's pretty much it, labor. And then your long-term factors are going to be your natural resources, your capital, like your assets, your land, your factory, your rent, these sorts of things, even your technology. So if you move on down in section 7.2, we have the production function. It says here Q equals the function of NR, L, K, T, and E. Don't worry about this. Don't memorize this. They just want you to know that, like, you can turn this into an alphabetical equation, or a mathematical equation, a conceptual equation. You can think about all of these different things in economics conceptually, and they want to start to kickstart that part of your brain to get you thinking. Okay, it's just a function of land, labor, capital, technology, and entrepreneurship, and that all of that equals your cost function, right? So just think of it that way. Don't let it scare you. It's not scary. Okay. So they give you an example down here with lumberjacks and trees, right? They say you have one 2-man saw, okay? And they want to know if you add short-term changes to your labor, how will it affect your output and your cost and all of these things, right? So our labor is represented by lumberjacks, which I think is fun. I wish I'd worn a flannel. I think I got the beard going okay. Okay, trees, of course, is what you're doing here. So you have one two-man saw. They say if you have one guy on a two-man saw, you can cut down 4 trees a day. Okay, if you have 2 guys, you can cut down 10 trees, right? And then your marginal product down here is 4 for the first, 6 for the second. And they say if you got 3 guys and a two-man saw, you can cut down 12 trees. And then if you move on to 4, you get 13, and 5, you get 13. So eventually you just have a bunch of guys standing around, I don't know, smoking or goofing off or whatever, and you're not really getting any more production out of them, right? And so it's a really silly concept to show you that, okay, we're getting more and more production out of our short-term labor change, our cost change, but eventually it's going to peter off and you're going to get a diminishing return. So again, a lot of these concepts are the same. We want to think marginal changes, right? We also want to think about diminishing returns. Like you can't just infinitely get the same amount of profit off of putting in your input, right? It doesn't work like that. So we need to start thinking about how do small changes affect changes, and where's our equilibrium point? Where's the best spot to be on the map, right? And so here, if as you keep adding people, you get 4 trees the first time, then you get an additional 6 after the second employee, and then you only get 2 on the third employee, and then 1, and then 0. So your marginal return is shrinking down to basically nothing. It's called asymptotic. And so if you look at these graphs down here, they represent what's happening, right? The marginal product for trees, basically, is what's happening. You're getting an increase in the marginal product, and then eventually it's petering off and coming down to basically 0. And asymptotic just means like it never really touches 0, but it becomes so small that it's theoretically 0. It's just a statistical when you're playing with curves. Okay, so really simple concepts. I know, like, we're adding graphs and all these functions and all of this algebraic stuff, and don't let it scare you, okay? If you look back at the function, again, it's Q is the cost, is simply equal to a function of land, labor, capital, technology, right? That's pretty simple, right? And I know when they put it out like that, you go, oh my God, what is all of that? Don't worry about it, okay? It's pretty simple stuff. And then here, if you move down to the graphs, again, this is just we're adding more lumberjacks. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they want to show that you get a little bit more trees chopped down as you add employees, and then the number of trees per employee starts to decrease dramatically, right? And that's this sort of this MP and L, the bottom right corner graph. All right, so it all looks scary. It's not as scary as it is, right? It's just new ways of conceptualizing these simple things that we think about every day in our life. All right, section 7.3, costs in the short run. They also want you to know that you can't really change your cost curve a whole lot on the short run. Excuse me, my throat's hurting. Okay, we have all of these different factor payments that we've sort of been talking about, touching on raw materials, rents and mortgages, wages and salaries, interests and dividends, which is how they pay you when you're buying stocks and bonds and things of that sort, and then profit. And so now we're going to start talking about marginal costs and how we can view costs and find the most efficient output versus cost in a graphical form. Okay, so we have average cost, which is just your total cost divided by your output, right? That's AC equals TC divided by Q. Again, it looks scary because it's mathematical. It's just saying total cost divided by your output equals your average cost, okay? And then the marginal cost is this delta, means change, the triangle, that's the Greek delta, and it just means there's a change in, okay? And so here it's saying MC equals delta TC divided by delta Q. All that is saying is that the marginal cost is equal to the change in the total cost divided by the change in the total output. So it's the exact same thing as above, except now we're talking about the delta, individual changes, right? And a lot of times this is how they symbolize time is moving in statistical models. They'll throw a delta in there, right? It just means this change right here, that's what the effect is it's causing this effect, right? That is the marginal cost. So above, when we're talking about the lumberjacks, we're talking about marginal production. So when you move from 1 to 2 lumberjacks, you get 6 additional production. That's the marginal production, right? If the change from 1 to 2. And then the change from 2 to 3, you only get an additional 2 marginal production, right? So when you scroll back down, this is the same exact concept, except now we're talking about cost. You get a whatever small change in total cost and total output. How does that affect the marginal change in the cost? Okay, and if you look at this graph below, figure 7.7, how output affects total costs. They want you to understand that there is a fixed cost. There is a cost that you cannot change, right? I think their example in the book is that they're running a barber shop. And the barbershop's rent, basically, and electricity, and the liners in the trash can, you've paid that, and there's no getting it back. Like, whether you cut a single hair or not, that is your fixed cost. It is stuck there, right? You have to pay the light bill. You got to pay the rent. Like, you already paid it. You put down a deposit and everything. So that's your fixed cost. There's no getting it back, and you have to calculate it in, okay? And a lot of this, when you're talking about fixed costs, this is what I was talking about earlier in your implicit costs. These are things that you can't get back. Like, you can't get back having driven a truck 500 miles. You got the wear and tear from that 500 miles. There's no getting it back, right? And so it's not really a cost that you calculated on your receipt books or that you could change, but it is a cost that's there, right? It's a fixed cost. So they need you to remember, like, this very first piece where you're at zero output. You're not at zero cost. You have a cost at zero output, and it is $160. And so we need to calculate that in understanding our marginal cost. Okay. If you look below at figure 7.8, we have the cost curves, and this is another way of sort of conceptualizing. Above, we have all of our costs all in one line. Okay. In figure 7.8, we're breaking it out. Okay, so we have the average total cost, which is the ATC line, and we have the average variable cost, which is the AVC line, and then we have the marginal cost, which is the MC line, right? And your AVC, your average variable cost, is always below the ATC, right? Because the ATC is calculating the sunk costs, basically. The $160 we were talking about in the graph above, the fixed cost, the ATC includes that. And so it's already part of it, whereas the AVC doesn't calculate it. The AVC is looking for the average value change. The ATC is calculating your fixed cost. So it's always going to be up a little bit above. And then we have our marginal cost, which, if you'll notice, it's a U-shaped curve, but it rises exponentially toward the end. And this is because, again, as I mentioned earlier, say we're making $10 profit on a baseball bat when we're producing 1,000 baseball bats, right? That doesn't mean that we should suddenly make 1 million baseball bats, because we're not going to get $10 profit on the next 990,000 baseball bats. There are diminishing returns because you just can't sell them, so they're going to be sitting on the shelves everywhere. There's going to be an inundation of baseball bats on the market. You suddenly paid all of these people to come in and make baseball bats, and now it's starting to cost you even more because you only have so much factory space, and so right, profit isn't infinite. You've got to find that sweet spot. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to find the sweet spot for our cost. And so if you look at it, what happens is your average total costs drop, right, as you start taking in that original sunk cost, that $160. Like, as we start cutting hair, man, we're dropping that cost real fast, right? And we're starting to actually like make money on the number of haircuts because the average variable cost is low per haircut, right? But eventually you start going up. Like, we've got 36 barbers in this room, and they're all bumping shoulders, and everyone's trying to answer the phone, and like somebody accidentally nicks the dude's ear next to you because there's just too many barbers in here, and our costs are starting to skyrocket, right? Because we just can't. Like, there's only even 8 chairs. Why do we have 36 barbers? It doesn't make sense. So eventually you get to that absurdity, and that's why it just starts to go straight up, right? And that's that exponentiation of the cost term. So, and we want to find that sweet spot, and that sweet spot is right where MC, the marginal cost, and ATC, your average total cost, meet. That's the perfect spot where you are producing every unit of output, or your next marginal unit of output, I should say, is at the absolute lowest level that it could be. And then after that point, your costs start to rise again a little bit, and then they start to skyrocket. So if you look at this little this table below where we have our labor, this is basically our number of barbers, I guess, right? And our one barber can do 16 haircuts in a day at an average variable cost of $5. Okay. Our second barber, now we can do 40 haircuts in a single day by adding another one, right? So we're getting a little bit more output. And our average variable costs have dropped down to $4 per haircut. And this is with everything included, right? This is with all of our labor, not our fixed costs, but this is all of our labor and all of that kind of stuff. So now we've reduced the cost to produce each extra haircut. We add a third barber, and now we're at 60 units, 60 haircuts per day with our third barber. We get an additional 20 marginal haircuts, and that means an additional or average variable cost of $4, right? So it matches the number 2, and so we should add a third barber. Now we get to the fourth barber, and suddenly we're starting to bump up against our cost frontier, and we can only now produce a marginal additional 12 haircuts, and that means that now it's costing us $4.44 per haircut. All right, so now we're not at our best output, which would be $4 per haircut. You see that? And so this labor at 3 is where ATC and MC meet on the graph. And after that, when you start adding barbers and adding haircuts, your marginal costs start to increase greatly. All right? I know it's a lot of information packed into one little spot, but if you read through the table and you try to plug it out in your mind and understand how these things work together, it'll make a lot of sense. And there's, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need to understand about the differences in the marginal output that you're putting in. Like, do I want to hire an additional pest control technician, right? Or is it just going to cost me like a little bit more? Do I want to try to spread my guys a little more thin until I can get a bit more business and then add an employee, right? So these are the decisions you have to make in the short term, and being able to understand fixed costs versus variable costs is very helpful as a business owner, and understanding that there are fixed costs that need to be calculated. Like, no matter what happens, these are things that I have to spend. I have to spend, the mileage on my cars. I have to spend the hours in my office that I'm not really thinking about. I have to spend the maintenance on my building. I have to spend the rent or the mortgage if I happen to own my commercial building, which is not, doesn't happen very often. So these are things that you have to take into consideration. All right. Section 7.4, production in the long run. So here, they just want you to know that you can change your technology, you can change your long run costs or production functions in the long run, right? It's just that you have to separate them. Here's our short term, like we can change our labor and our output a little bit. Here's our long term, where we can buy a new factory or build some new land or upgrade our equipment. And there are different cost functions, right? And then eventually we'll get down to this funky one, the SRAC, down at the bottom with all the different graphs. And this is where you start to build in the two different cost functions together, the short-term cost function versus the long-term cost function. So as an economist or as a business owner, you can start thinking conceptually about long-term versus short-term costs and production, and what should I do to make my long-term production most efficient, and what can I do in the short term to make my profit function most efficient, and all of these things. Just, we need to start thinking about these things separately. All right, so back to section 7.4. Really not a lot here. They just want you to think that we can add some new technology, we can add a new factory. We're going to move on to section 7.5, costs in the long run. It's basically the same concept, but I don't need to talk about both production and costs. So if we're talking about costs in the long run, these are things that we can change in the long run, right? That, like we've been talking about, you can buy a new factory, you can expand your factory floor, you can. What are some other things? You can lobby governments, regional, state, national. You can lobby governments to change rules for you to make costs different, right? That's why we see so much lobbying money being sent to Washington, D.C. and state capitals, things like this, because that really does affect your cost function, right? And if you can reduce, say you can't reduce any of your land costs, and you cannot reduce your input costs because you're using, say, rare earth materials, and you can't really change your labor costs because you're using highly paid and highly specified engineers. I guess I'm building Texas Instruments right now, right? So you've got a very technology-driven company that has high cost input for its what do you call them? Geez, why am I not thinking? Rare earth materials, right? Rare earth materials. You need lots of weird little metals and stuff to be able to build your circuitry and calculators or whatever it is. You have to have the world's best engineers, and so you can't really change your cost function there. You can't really change your cost function because you're in Austin, Texas, and land is at a premium, and you can't. I mean, how are you going to buy a new giant piece of land to build a new factory on? That's really difficult. So if you're in that situation, what do, right? You go to your government to say, maybe you can help us buy some of these rare earth materials, or maybe you can guarantee some of the rare earth materials that the U.S. government itself pulls out of the ground, or maybe you can offer us subsidies and training for our engineers, or right, and so these are the ways that you can use lobbying to affect your long-term costs, right? So that's something that you should consider as well. start thinking outside the box about costs and production functions and things like this, especially if you're a business owner. There are lots of ways to manipulate your cost and your production functions, is what I'm saying. Okay, and so if you think about the long term, and you're thinking about how many pieces of a good do we produce, you start to put this S-rack together, right? And it's pretty cool. So you have your short run cost curve, and then you have your long run cost curve, which is the blue line, and then you have the little pink short run cost curves, and it's teaching you that we need to consider we can be anywhere on this long-term cost curve, and so we should probably choose anywhere between 2 and 4, right? Where do we want to output on this long term given our different cost functions? So it's just a way to visualize, here are our short-term vision, here are our long-term vision, and this is how we can sort of meld them together. And then down here you have, this is a long-term cost curve, right? In the short term, you can only really produce 10,000 units efficiently. You're at that R point. But if you can change your long-term, your average cost curve, you can decide as a company, do we want to shrink down and focus a little better and just produce 5,000, or do we want to scale up and produce 20,000? What is the future market going to look like? Is there going to be a need for greater demand? So again, we're gonna start expanding our vision of what costs and production and output look like, and how do we compartmentalize each piece of it, right? Here are compartmentalized short-term costs, compartmentalized long-term costs, compartmentalized short-term productions, compartmentalized long-term productions. So let's start tearing each piece apart so we can learn individualized pieces of information about how we can see a firm and production in the long run. So that's the basics. We will get more nitty-gritty as the chapters go on. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, sort of post them on the YouTube. And stay warm and stay safe, and have a great day, guys.